You may have noticed from the flyer that this lesson was going to be the last one, but I'm changing some of what we're going to be doing this morning. In some of the conversations that I've been having with you guys and thinking about the work that you guys are doing here, I thought it would be best to look at hope in this lesson, and then in the sermon period, look at the story of Job and how he endured the difficulties that he endured. But the way that these things will connect, one of them being that what if you really make your meaning and your hope based on the things of God? What can somebody like that endure and go through? And I think Job is an example of somebody who put his meaning in life in God, and he put his hope in God. And so we'll see some things about that as we go through, but that'll connect with what we've been looking at. But the lesson that was on morality was supposed to be for now. We're going to shelve that one and look at Job in the sermon period. So what we've been doing, though, from Friday, Saturday, and now this morning, is we've been comparing worldviews and looking at different human needs that we have. We all have a need for meaning. We all have a need for hope. And one of the ways that Jesus would appeal to people, we looked at this on Friday night. Jesus talked about the thief coming to steal and kill and destroy. He came that he might give life and give it abundantly. Jesus calls out to people by saying, I am the one who can satisfy your deepest longings. If you were to look at the Gospel of John and look at all the different ways Jesus appeals to people, there are times that he appeals to people based on final judgment. There are times that he appeals to people based on the signs that he's doing. There's other times that he appeals to people based on your deepest needs that are not being satisfied because Jesus is not your shepherd. It's an interesting study to go through the Gospels and ask yourself, what appeals does Jesus make? So one of the things that I'm trying to accomplish in these lessons is expand this kind of appeal that Jesus gives. How is it that we can reason with people based on the deep needs that they have? And what we're going to be looking at today is our need for hope. Everybody lives with reference to what they think about the future. If you think that the future seems really bleak, you're going to have a bleak mindset in the present. If you have a hopeful mindset about the future, you're going to be hopeful about the future in the present. And so what is some evidence in our culture that we have some degree of hopelessness? And I'll go ahead and open this up for discussion. When you look around at our society, what are some evidences that you see that people in our culture don't have hope? Yeah.
Just the sheer number of suicides that continue to rise?
Yeah, the suicide rates are increasing, especially, by the way, for younger women. Social media has done a lot to destroy the self-image of women, and so that's the group that is increasing in suicide rates more than any other. What other evidences might there be of lack of hope in our culture?
Increased substance abuse.
Yeah, good. Increased substance abuse.
The number of people that are choosing to shun worship and don't even go to church anymore.
Okay, good. Yeah. What's the point of religion? What? Any other ones you can think of? Yeah.
The lack of just getting married.
Okay. Man, you guys are sharp. All right. So I got declining birth rates. Whenever a society has less and less people having children, that's typically a sign that we don't have good prospects about the future. Increasing suicide rates and then increasing SSRI rates. That's just another term for like antidepressants, anti-anxieties. Now, I wouldn't say that everybody that's on those things is sinning because they're on them. At the same time, I would say that I think our culture overprescribes these things, and that for a lot of these people, if they have the hope that God has promised in Scripture, they would have some of these things alleviated. So you have to be careful how you talk about some of that kind of stuff. But so if this is in our society, some of the evidence is of a lack of hope, it would beg the question to say, okay, well, how is it that our culture is trying to instill hope in people? Because like we talked about with meaning yesterday, there are approaches that people have to trying to find hope in this life. Whatever our culture is pushing is clearly not working. But what I want to do, like we did yesterday, is we're going to look at the secular approach to hope building and what the problems are with it, and then look at the biblical approach. So the first approach that a skeptic would say, this is how I find hope in life. is they would say that I hope to leave the world a better place, that when I leave the world, I've left some kind of contribution to it. Catherine Osmond is an atheist who wrote a book called Grace Without God, and in that book, she's writing about how she walked away from her faith and she could still find hope and meaning in life and all this sort of thing. And this is one of the things that she says in her book. You need to tell your kids that you're a secular humanist and tell them what that means, he said. She's getting an interview with a guy in San Diego, and so she's reporting on this interview. You need to say, we believe in making the world a better place, we believe in evidence over faith, we believe in reason as a way to address problems, we believe in helping others because that makes the world better for everybody. This is what we believe. If you are a humanist, what does that mean that you believe in? Well, if you're a Marxist, you believe in Karl Marx's writings. If you're an atheist, you believe in the ideas of there being no God. This brings up this idea that you're a secular humanist. What is a humanist? What is somebody who believes in humanism? Humanism says that we as human beings, we can bond together and we can solve all of the world's problems as long as we all work together, and we can end all the problems in the world, all that sort of thing, if we just work hard enough to do all of that sort of thing. Raise your hand, or does anybody have any anecdotes? Have you talked to any secular people that say, this is my hope, that I've left some kind of contribution to the world when I have died, but I don't believe that there's God, I don't believe that there's an afterlife, but this is what I put my hope in. Do you guys feel like you've known some people that sort of follow that idea? All right, so the question then would be, what are some of the problems with this perspective? And one of the major problems is that it's very naive to think that you will make the world a better place. One way that I like to show this when I study with skeptics, because remember, I'm trying to reason from within their worldview, I'm quoting their people. So what have skeptics said about this sort of thing? So H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds, he wrote The Time Machine, he wrote a lot of other kinds of literature as well. He wrote A History of the World, and he wrote this in 1922, and this was right after World War II. He said, "Can we doubt that presently our race will more than realize our boldest imaginations, that it will achieve unity and peace, that it will live, the children of our blood, and lives will live in a world made more splendid and lovely than any palace or garden that we know, going on from strength to strength in an ever-widening circle of adventure and achievement? What man has done, the little triumphs of his present state, all that this history we have told, form but the prelude of things that man has yet to do." All right, what is H.G. Wells' perspective after World War I? And by the way, back then they didn't call it World War I. They didn't anticipate a sequel, and so they called it the Great War back then. But what is he thinking after World War I has been done? What does he think about the future here?
Renaissance.
Yeah, Renaissance. It's onward and upward. Everything's going to be really great. We've got all the killing out of our system, and now we can just move forward as a collective society across the world. And then 23 years later, World War II has happened. And what is more prominent, like the technology to take photographs and videos of things, and what's happening in the Nazi concentration camps is more widely known. What do you think that would do to somebody like H.G. Wells' perspective? That we can come together and we can make everything better, secular humanism. What would World War II, do you think, do to somebody that had these kind of hopes, that we're going to make this world a better place now? It's going to crush it. So the last book that H.G. Wells wrote is called The Mind at the End of Its Tether. You can imagine why it's titled that. It's like 45 pages long. And look what he says. "The cold-blooded massacres of the defenseless, the return of deliberate and organized torture, mental torment, and fear to a world from which such things seemed well-nigh vanished, has come here to break in my spirit altogether. Homo sapiens, as he has been pleased to call himself, is played out." 23 years later, this guy that thought onward and upward has now been crushed and demoralized because he's realized that all of these hopes that I had to make the world a better place and to be part of this utopia that we're headed towards, he realizes is not the case. Now, one reason why I think younger people attach themselves to social movements is because they think we are the ones that's finally going to make a difference. But quickly after that, there is the return of corrupted power, there's the return in this, what he says here, deliberate torture, mental torment, fear to a world that I thought all this stuff was banished from. Is there any problem with trying to make a positive contribution in the world? No. But the point is that if your worldview says that there's no afterlife and there's everything, the solar flare is going to destroy it all, then what's the point? I'll come back to that in just a moment. But let me show you a passage in Ecclesiastes that relates to this. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I think there's a little bit of a problem with the syncing of the PowerPoint there. But in Ecclesiastes 1:15, the writer begins by saying there are certain things in this world that are crooked that are never going to be made straight again. You know what the world can do? I do an on-campus Bible study with the college students at WKU, and it's been interesting to me that less and less people take philosophy classes now, but more and more people take psychology classes. So I asked the class one time, how many of you would say that in your psychology classes you've learned some things about yourself? And like every hand went up, that for people that took these psychology classes. And then my follow-up question was, how many of you feel like you've been fundamentally changed for the better by learning those things? And like all the hands went down. You know what the world can do? It can analyze what's crooked. It can say, well, there's this ill in society. There's this problem in your psychology. Look at all these problems, but the world lacks the ability to be able to fix the problems. And so, if you think that you can diagnose all the problems in the world, don't think that just because you can diagnose the problems that you can also solve everything. One way that you can imagine this is, let's say that you're on an airplane, and you got 7 minutes to coast into a mountain, and you're all going to die. And so you got 7 minutes, so you're like, I'm going to stretch my legs, I'm going to get up and go to the bathroom. And you go to the bathroom, you know the little door that you, you pull in or out, it's always confusing, but you eventually find your way to the bathroom, and when you lock the door, that light's supposed to go on, and the light's not working, so it's very frustrating. Like, you got 5 minutes left to live now, and you can't even go to the bathroom in peace. So you open the door, and you go to the steward human, because you're not supposed to say stewardess anymore. So you go to the steward human, and you say, hey, the light's not working. We've got to fix the light. And the steward human is going to say what to you?
Why?
Why? What's the point? We're all going to crash and burn one day. So if you are a secular humanist, and your worldview says that we're all going to crash and burn one day, there's going to be no more consciousness, nobody's going to remember anything that you do. That's your worldview. But yet, at the same time, you care about leaving the world a better place, a world that's going to crash and burn. Have you thought that leaving the world a better place is not ultimately going to matter for anybody? So what is the problem with survival of the fittest and taking what you can while you live? What's the problem with it? It doesn't seem to make sense that you'd be concerned with that. So that's one problem with this, is that if you think you're going to leave the world a better place, you might make things better for a couple of years for some groups of people, and if you're a Christian and you can make those kinds of contributions, maybe you make the world a better place for certain people that can then learn the gospel, and that has meaning to eternity. But if you're a secular person, anything you do is not going to ultimately matter anyways. Now, there's a second problem with this, and that is that this approach, like we talked about yesterday, cannot apply to everybody in the world. I like what Timothy Keller says here about this. Imagine how ludicrous it would have been to sit down with a group of early 19th century slaves and say, there will never be a judgment day in which wrongdoing will be put right. There is no future world and life in which your desires will ever be satisfied. This life is all there is. When you die, you simply cease to exist. Our only real hope for a better world lies in improved social policy. Now, with these things in mind, go out there, keep your head high, and live a life of courage and love. Don't give in to despair. Would you like to go to the 1800s and go to a slave in Mississippi and say, look, you guys are really religious and you have all these great hymns, that you sing, but it's all fake. And in fact, you guys are too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. What you need to do is you need to become more involved in social policy changes. And they hold up their shackles and they go, okay, where do we start? What are we going to do? I don't know if you guys have ever read the book Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. It's one of my favorite books, and it's a very short one. But Howard Thurman his mom was a slave in Georgia. And he became a Baptist minister. And so I don't agree with him on everything. But he wrote a book, and Martin Luther King Jr., there were two books he always carried with him. One of them was the Bible, and the other one was Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Now it's interesting because the beginning of the book talks about Howard Thurman being interviewed by a Hindu guy from India. And the person from India looked at Howard Thurman having adopted a form of Christianity. And the Hindu guy looked at Howard Thurman and said, "Why is it that you've adopted the religion of your captors? Of the people that have held you guys captive and held you down. It looks like it's just further submission that you guys would adopt any form of Christianity, that you guys would believe in Jesus or the Bible, when who did they learn about Jesus from?" Have you ever thought about this before, by the way? Where did the early slaves learn about Jesus? From their hypocritical masters. How could those people have ever been compelled to believe in Jesus when they're taking passages out of context and talking about slaves needing to obey in these cruel kinds of ways, and they're being whipped and they're being mistreated, sometimes in the name of Jesus? Why would these people ever believe in Jesus? And here's what Howard Thurman's argument is in the book. Jesus was an oppressed minority. Roman Empire. Jesus' people have been pushed down, the Jews have been, and here's Jesus who is reaching out to people that are in need. Have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus is so compelling that even when hypocritical people who are holding down slaves, that those slaves can still see something compelling about them? You want to take that away from people in the world? There is no Jesus, there is no afterlife, all that kind of thing. It's naive to think that you're going to change the world ultimately, because it's going to crash and burn anyways in your worldview. And people who are suffering, this worldview of trying to make the world a better place does not resonate with them because there's no recourse that they have. So that's the first approach, though, is that if I can leave the world a better place, okay, but it falls apart. Here's the second approach that people would have to trying to leave the world a better, or to deal with hope, is that you have to learn to embrace death as a natural part of life. When I was in San Diego, one of the things that Samantha and I and the kids would do, my work schedule has always been, I work between services on Sunday, because Sunday's already the work day. And so I get lunch and then I go back to the office and I'm starting to get ready for Wednesday night and the next, and organize my week and stuff. And then I try to take Friday and Saturday off. And so when we were living in San Diego, every Friday and Saturday morning, we as a family would go to different coffee shops in San Diego because they had really good coffee shops there. And there was one time when Samantha and I and Asher, I don't think Abigail was born yet, we sat like kind of next to this woman who overheard Samantha and I talking about some things from church and whatever. And she was like, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And she said, "So my job is to counsel people when they're dying in hospitals." She's a hospice psychologist, I think is what it was. And so she said, one of the things that I try to do is I try to learn from different worldviews on how different worldviews process death. And I said, "Okay, that's interesting. So like, what's your perspective on it? When you talk to people, what do you tell them?" And she says, "Well, the biggest thing that I've seen across a lot of religions is that you have to embrace death as a beautiful, natural part of life. And that if you try to fight it, then you're not going to win. And so the other option then is to just embrace it as a part of life." This is a common view that's shared by pantheistic religions, Hindu people, things like this. And Catherine Osmond approaches this in this way. And this is, by the way, in this part of the book, her daughter is looking out the window across, and there's a church building across the street. And her daughter's looking out the window and goes, "Our grandma just died. My grandma just died. Where is she, Mom?" And this is the thing that she says to herself that she can't say to her daughter, but this is what she believes. Look at what this says. "Our bodies decompose, falling back into the earth, merging with all other matter that makes up our planet. In the future, our decomposed bodies might provide nutrients to the trees. Someone might hang a swing from one of those trees, or sit beneath the shade of its leafy branches, or make a painted horse from its wood." That just sounds so beautiful. she can't bring herself to say this to her daughter because her daughter's not old enough. But here's what she believes. We're going to die, and our bodies will decompose, and maybe it'll feed a tree, and maybe that tree can have like a beautiful swing, or it'll be cut down and somebody will like a painted horse from it. You get to be part of a painted horse. You're like, well, it's so beautiful. Now, maybe more culturally relevant than Catherine Osmond is The Lion King. I don't know if the new version has this same dialogue in it, but you ever realize how pantheistic The Lion King is? Here it is. Mufasa. Everything you see exists together in a delicate balance. As king, you need to understand that balance and respect all the creatures, from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope. Right, so Mufasa, Daddy, we have to respect all creatures. Okay, I can get on board with that, but Dad, I got a question. Young Simba, don't we eat the antelope? Good question. Really good question. And then Mufasa says, yes, Simba, but let me explain. When we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, so we are all connected to the great circle of life. And then there's that song about the circle of life, and it's all beautiful because we die, and we decompose, and then we become grass, and look at how beautiful that is, and we're supposed to celebrate it. This is the worldview that is in that. I think it's still a great movie, by the way. But just be aware of that kind of thing. All right, so how many of you are okay with, okay, you know what? I've become so smart that I don't need God or the Bible or religion, and I'm going to adopt the secular worldview. And then somebody says, okay, well, what's your hope? My hope is that I get to feed the antelope one day. My hope is that I get to be a painted horse. There are people in our culture that really, in a way that they think is sophisticated, are adopting this worldview. There's more shows on Netflix, for example, that are showing this kind of worldview. What are the problems with this approach? There's a couple problems with this. Number one is you have no control over your remains. In both of these quotes, it's like, okay, my remains might feed a tree. And then Simba says, or Mufasa, whatever the one was, Mufasa says that we get to eat the grass and become. You know what's funny even about Mufasa in the movie? Where does he die? In a canyon. Do you think he's going to decompose and feed the grass in a canyon? I don't think so. He has no control over it. Okay, so what your hope is that my remains will be some kind of beneficial thing. What if I feed a tree one day, somebody cuts that tree down, makes a baseball bat out of it, and puts barbed wire over it, and does a bunch of bad stuff with it? If you're putting your hope in what will happen to your remains that you have no control over, do you see that it's not very satisfying to think that way? Now, here's another problem with it. Is there's not going to be any ultimate final justice. If all of us are going to be dust that scatters across the world, feeding trees and feeding antelope, there's no such thing ultimately as justice. Which is ironic because in our culture, a lot of the people that would say that we want justice are the same people that say that we're going to feed a tree one day. Okay, do you really want justice? I thought, like, which worldview actually gives you justice? It's the biblical worldview. But look at this quote. No matter what you choose to believe or what good or evil actions you take in life, we all end exactly where we began, as stardust. This is what atheists would say. Like a drop of water falling back into the ocean. That's what a Hindu would say. That, my friend, or a Buddhist, that, my friends, is the real horror. If you believe this secular approach to hope, you just have to embrace death as a beautiful natural part of life, my DNA will feed other things. Your worldview also says there's no ultimate substantive difference between Jesus and Stalin. Hitler always gets all the hate, and rightfully so. We've got to spread the hate around. Or Mao Zedong. There's no ultimate justice and no ultimate difference between these people. Are you comfortable, Mr. Secular person, acknowledging that on the one hand you want justice, but on the other hand your worldview gives you no justice? So that's another problem with it. But here's another problem. No matter how much we try to say that we're going to embrace death as a natural part of life, nobody looks forward to the moment of death. Instinctively, we all know that death is an enemy. Look at 1 Corinthians 15, verses 25 and 26. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. When I had that conversation with that woman at the coffee shop, this is the passage that I brought up to her. I said that in the biblical worldview, that death is counted as an enemy. It's not counted as some kind of beautiful thing that you embrace. What happens after you die is maybe a beautiful thing to embrace. But the moment of death is still an enemy in the Bible. And one way that you could just kind of gut check that, do you remember during COVID, during the Rona time, and they had the death counters on CNN and Fox News? Like, there's been so many people that have died, so many people that have died. And look at it, like, this, you know, we're number one, phone finger number one of all the countries. Like, look at what we're doing. Did anybody look at those counters and go, it's just so beautiful? It's just embrace it. It's just such a wonderful thing. No, nobody, atheist, Christian, nobody just instinctively thought, this is it. Look, I hope those numbers keep getting higher and higher, unless you believe in depopulation, and that's a whole other thing. But that's the secular approach to hope. I'm going to try to leave the world a better place. You're not really going to. Okay, but I believe that my remains can feed something. And you have no control over it, you have no justice then, and you instinctively still know that death is an enemy. So, what is the biblical approach to hope? What does the Bible say about how we get hope? And the most concise passage that I know of in the Bible to deal with this is 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 and 17. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpets of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Notice that this last part, we will always be with the Lord. Have you ever sensed that no matter where you live, there's a degree of homesickness that you have? Well, I grew up in Minnesota, and since it snowed 18 months out of the year, I never really felt like I was at home there. And then I moved to Nashville, where everybody looked the same, but they sounded funny with their accents. And since I was a Northerner and we won the war, like there's like, I don't know if we're ever going to be fully embraced here. And then we moved to California, and I really liked California, but there's problems with California too. And we moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I've never seen worse drivers in all my life there. And there's really good people at the church there, but there's just, there's some problems there. And we moved to Bowling Green, and we really like it there. That's like a great place, but there's problems there too. Have you ever sensed that no matter where you live, there's a degree of homesickness? That's because the story of the Bible teaches that we were created to be in communion with God in this paradise, but paradise was lost when the serpent came in and deceived Eve, and Adam went along with it. And ever since then, human beings have been evicted from the full presence of God like we were created to be in. And the whole story of the Bible is God trying to encroach upon them and get closer in the tabernacle. And then he dwells amongst them in the tabernacle. And then they reject him again. And then the temple eventually has got to be destroyed, showing that they've rejected him. But then it gets rebuilt. And then Jesus has to come to it and cleanse it and say that you guys still haven't been doing the right thing. And then Jesus dies, and the veil on the temple tears in half, showing that God's presence is now going to be able to go out to everybody. And every time we get a greater understanding of God, every time we understand him better through reading the Bible, every time a brother or sister in Christ blesses us in some way, and we realize that that's an extension of God's kindness, we're getting little tastes of where we're ultimately going. But until we're there, we're never going to feel like we're ultimately at home. How is God described in the Bible? God of all comfort, the light of the world, the good shepherd, the refuge for the oppressed, the Father, perfect God of peace, the God of grace, he's our Redeemer. All of these different descriptions of God can be summed up with the word love. All of the light that you see outside emanates from the sun. All of the love you have ever experienced in your life emanates from God. And for some people, this world is the closest they'll ever be to hell, and for others, this is the closest they'll ever be to heaven. What hell is all of the good things you experienced in this life that God even gave his enemies is being sucked away from you. But for those who are Christians, we get to be with the Lord forever. And it's not just that this passage says we get to be with the Lord. Notice that it talks in verse 17 about we who are left will be caught up together with them. You know, in the pantheistic religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, in this modern view that I die and I get to feed a tree, you're like a dewdrop going back into the water, which means that you lose your individuality. You no longer get to be you. You get absorbed into something else. But this passage still uses words like we. Like, you still get to be you. You will always be you. Sometimes brethren will say that if we can't get along on earth, how will we get along in heaven? And you know what's true about even the best of saints is that we're not always going to get along with each other perfectly. Sometimes we rub each other the wrong way. Sometimes we're like sandpaper towards each other. But sometimes that helps us smooth out and grow, so that can be cool. But you want to know why love is agonizing in this life? We want to be loved for our own sake. You know, have you've met the people that are like the snake oil salesman, like that the only reason they want to talk to you, the only reason they want to get to know you is for networking purposes, but they don't actually care about you. We want people to love us for who we are, not for what they can extract from us. And love can be agonizing, because have you ever had a time before where you loved somebody and the only thing they cared about was extracting things from you? Love is agonizing because we want it to be mutual. Have you ever loved somebody who did not love you back? That's agonizing. Love is agonizing because our loved ones, we want them to be happy. I remember there was a woman at the church in California before Asher was born, our firstborn. And she said, once he's born, you're going to realize that your heart doesn't belong to you anymore. Because if he's sick, it's going to be on your mind. If there's something wrong with any of your kids, you can't get it off your mind. It's always like a storm cloud hovering over you. We want to be able to love people without ever having to say goodbye to them. You ever had to say goodbye to a brother or sister in Christ? When I first became a Christian, sometimes we'd sing the song, "Blessed be the tie that binds. When we asunder part, it brings us inward pain." And I used to think as a new Christian who would have to go back to my home with mom and dad who were yelling at me all the time, I would always think that that part of the song meant, oh yeah, every time we have to say goodbye on Sundays or Wednesdays, it's just really hard, but I'll see you guys in a couple days again. Until I started realizing that that was actually talking about Christians dying. The hardest times in my life has been when I had to move and say goodbye to people that meant a lot to me. Love is agonizing. But the Bible teaches that one day, and we looked at this verse yesterday, beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be is not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. We're all going to be perfected, where love will not be agonizing in the new heavens and the new earth, in the afterlife. It won't have a degree of agonizing to it. All the tears will be wiped away, and you get to be you forever. And this is all possible because Jesus rose from the dead. Do you know, have you ever heard somebody in a trite kind of way? You know, people give platitudes sometimes. Something's going really bad and they'll say, it's all going to be okay. And you think to yourself, no, it's not. I know it's not going to be. How do you know anyways? You know, it's not a platitude. It's not just a cheap saying to tell somebody who's going through something difficult, it's all going to be okay. Ultimately, it will all be okay. Your cars might keep breaking down. Your health might keep breaking down. A tornado might come and destroy your house. But ultimately, if you're in the Lord, everything will be okay. How do you want to find hope? I'm going to try to leave the world a better place. That's going to be destroyed by a solar flare. And nobody will remember a thing anyways. I want to try to feed a tree. And you got no control and there's no justice. Do you realize that as Christians, you have the goods? You're surrounded in this city by a bunch of people that might think that they're the ones who are educated. They're the ones who are sophisticated. Well, you guys are meeting in this basement building here. You guys are the ones who are pathetic. You are the ones who got nothing. And the truth is, you're the ones who have the true riches. The responsibility that we have, though, is to be able to go and reason with people about that, to prod them and ask them questions. Hey, have you thought about what's going to happen to you after you die? If you've got a worldview that can't help you after you die, there's something wrong with your worldview. Do you want to talk about some of these things? see, we got about 7 minutes here. And so what I want to do, just for do we end at 45?
Yes.
Okay, if we end a little early, that's fine. But I just want to open this up. Do you guys have any comments or questions just about this approach to studying with skeptics? Does it make sense that you compare the secular worldview to the Christian worldview? And just the comparison alone shows you that God's got what everybody needs. But do you guys have any comments or questions about any of this?
Can we mail out your slides to everybody?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You made mention about, World War I and World War II. I was stationed in Germany from 77 to 79. And what I found out over there is no religion. All of the area I was in Germany gave up on God. You go to the cathedrals in France and visiting around, they're all empty.
Yes.
They gave up in God. Why would God permit such suffering to allow to take place?
Yeah.
And they lost all faith in themselves and they lost all hope in God. And because of that, they were blaming it basically on what you were saying, us human secularism. They had no hope for God in the future, so they gave up on everything, and God included.
Yes. And I went to the Czech Republic a few summers ago, and there was giant cathedrals, church buildings that are just vacant. And I asked one of the locals there, I said, so why is it that nobody goes to these buildings? And she said, well, have you thought about our history? The Crusades, like people using their religion and taking up arms and killing other people and demanding that they convert and things like this. Can you imagine having that as part of your cultural background and then somebody holds up a Bible and says, hey, you want to study this? Not really, because our society's been scorched by people that misuse the scriptures. Some of the questions that I like to ask people to prod in some of these conversations, like I mentioned yesterday how when I was in California I'd go to a Starbucks a lot. There's a time when I was having a Bible study with a guy, and this guy kept looking at us, and he just had this angry look on his face. And eventually I just looked at him and I said, is there a problem here? And he's like, please take that and get out of this building. Like, get this Bible study out of here. I said, well, is it because of how loud we're talking, or is it because of what we're talking about? He said, it's because what you're talking about. I hate that stuff. I said, well, sir, with all due respect, we're going to finish this study. We finished the study with him glancing back at us awkwardly every couple minutes. And then the guy that I studied with, he left. And then I went to the guy and I said, did you have a bad religious experience? You could respond to something like that and go, you're a jerk, and I can't believe, First Amendment rights, and I can go ahead and do whatever I want in a public setting, blah, blah, blah. Don't tread on me. Or you could go up to somebody and say, did you have a bad religious experience? And guess what he talked to me about for an hour? His hypocritical daddy. That made him hate religion. Just vomited it all up on me. One way that you can think about when people are hurtful towards religious people is if you were going to cut somebody with glass, you'd have to break the glass first. The reason why something can be sharp and hurt you is because it had to be broken at one point. When people are sharp towards you and your religion, it's because they've been broken in some way. They probably had a bad religious experience. They probably didn't have Christianity accurately represented to them. So asking people the question, did you have a bad religious experience? Asking people the question, what does the Bible teach that you don't like? And this gets us into some of the emotional reasons that people have for not being a Christian. There's one guy that I talked to recently that has left the Lord, and one of the I was trying to figure out different ways to reason with him, and the question that I finally landed on for him was, what do you miss most about being a Christian? And he said, well, the community. I don't have any friends anymore. Like, okay, well, there's an avenue. Like, there's an emotional tie that he wants to have community again. Let's explore that one, because that's something that he sees he's missing by not being a Christian anymore. We can exploit that one for the Lord. And so, you just have to come up with, think about good questions. You don't have to know all the quotes that I brought up in this. I'll give the PowerPoint slides and everything like that. But I hope that what these 3 lessons have done has given you more confidence in your worldview as a Christian, challenged you to ask yourself, am I really finding my hope in God and my meaning in God? And it's given you some ideas of things you could ask and point out about weaknesses in their worldview. But I'm glad to share the PowerPoints and have all of that stuff printed out for you. Yes, Scott?
One thing I've learned from you over the last 3 days is changing my perspective on where other people might be coming from, whether it's from their rejection or their willingness to study with you. But my biggest obstacle, and I think it's a me problem, if somebody came up to me and wanted to talk to me about religion or anything else, my first thought is, if I wanted to talk to you about something, I'll let you know. I don't want to interact with other people, and I know it's a me problem, but how do you overcome that?
If I'm at a coffee shop and I need to use the plugin and there's like, hey, can I use that plugin or whatever, like, are you here for work? Like, I just start getting to know the person. And I'll oftentimes wait for them to ask me what I do. I don't go, Eric Borlaug, evangelist. You know, I don't lead that way. I think that's weird. But if somebody, I just try to get to know people. And that takes a little bit more investing. But just like going up to somebody like, hey, you want to study the Bible? There's some guys that do that and do that well, but that doesn't fit, I don't think, my strengths. But I think just, slowly, and I'd say too, that hospitality-wise, if any of you guys have non-Christian friends, do you know how effective it can be to have a potluck and then invite like 1 or 2 families to that potluck that are not Christians, so that they can get to know and see the genuineness and sincerity of these kinds of people? If there's one book that I would recommend all of you guys to read on knowing how to talk to people about spiritual things, it's the book called Tactics by Greg Koukl. I don't agree with all of his theology, but if you want a good book on learning how to use questions to dialogue with people about spiritual things, Tactics by Greg Koukl, and Koukl is Koukl. But between that book, themeetup.com, going to coffee shops, things like that, I hope that those are some practical things that you guys can employ in the work that you're trying to do here. And that these lessons have given you more courage about your worldview and given you some ideas to not be so intimidated when you hear somebody else's worldview. Like, they might sound sophisticated, they might have read a lot of books that have big words in them, but at the end of the day, there's no substance to their worldview. And it's just a matter of you knowing that, and then you knowing how to expose that. So any other final comments or questions? Yeah.
You study with a secular humanist, and you show them reasonably, logically that, their hope or their meaning is ends in feeding a tree or something like this. Yeah. Have you had much progress with them, and what's the biggest pushback to get past that? Because they're pretty well entrenched in making the world a better place. That's enough for them. When you take it to the logical conclusion, all of your life is meaningless, and I would argue the best thing you can do is kill yourself right now, speed up that process, right? But they're not going to do that. They're not going to follow that. You can show them hope in the Bible, but it's hard to get to that transition for them to adopt some sort of religion, because they've rejected all that.
Right, like I said yesterday, this is not a magic bullet. This is another tool in the toolbox. There's sometimes where preachers will come to another place like, this study is sweeping the nation and everybody will be converted. No, the Bible still says most people won't be. And so the 2 reactions that I get whenever I've gotten somebody to the logical conclusion of their worldview is either they don't want to talk about it anymore because they want to amuse themselves to death now, or those people end up being converted. Because they realize that it's in my best interest that this is true, and I just haven't thought deeply enough about this. The worldview that lets you think deeply about the biggest questions is the one that wins, and that's Christianity. Because your other worldview, you don't want to think all day long about how you're going to be stench and worms and nobody will remember you. But the Christian worldview says that my body will decay, but I will be raised from the dead one day, and I will always get to be me. It's much more satisfying and it fits our design. You got to kill part of your brain to be okay with the secular worldview. But what you're trying to do is put it right in front of them. Do you see how ugly your view is? Now, and it's not just that. Now let's replace it with something that is much better. So, yeah. All right, we are a little past time, but I don't know if anybody has any final comments or questions. All right, so, yeah, go ahead.
I think I sit here and I'm thinking about the word hope, and I thought maybe I would address a little bit of my feelings about the word hope, if that's okay. Hope to the average person, the worldly person, and even most Christians, is hope it will come to pass, or maybe it won't. Hope is not a certain thing, but to the Christian, hope is a certain expectation.
Yeah.
It's bound to happen. I have the hope of eternal life.
Right.
I know I'm going into eternity, and there's no question about it not happening.
Yeah, good. All right, well, we are, do I leave this announcement thing up?
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna leave that up, and then, we're gonna look at the book of Job in a little while, and see what kind of person is created who really finds these things in God.